President Donald Trump's auto tariffs were supposed to bring jobs back home, build American, buy American. But the F-150, it's stitched together with parts from South Korea, Canada, Mexico, even Romania. And when those 25% tariffs hit, they didn't just shake the industry, they cracked it wide open. Suddenly, made in America didn't mean what we thought. Factories stalled, prices spiked, union workers felt disregarded, and automakers, they turned to automation, not jobs, but they got to do that to survive. Did Trump's tariffs unintentionally trigger an industry meltdown? Why are factories full of parts but short on workers? And most importantly, what does this mean for you? Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll realize the Ford F-150 didn't just reveal a broken truck, it revealed a broken system, the 25% shockwave. This was not just another policy tweak, it was a full-blown economic earthquake. The mere mention of a 25% tariff sent immediate tremors through the automotive world. The tariffs targeted a broad swath of vehicles crossing into the United States. But the tricky part was that even so-called domestic models could not escape the blow. Once you incorporate a single foreign-sourced part, that truck or sedan tumbles into a gray zone of complicated compliance rules. For automakers, particularly those relying on a patchwork of suppliers scattered across multiple continents, the chain reaction was terrifying. Engineers and financial officers alike scrambled to recalculate cost estimates, worried that a single mislabeling could balloon into multi-million-dollar penalties. With something as ubiquitous as the Ford F-150, almost every major system has an international thread, from transmissions crossing borders multiple times during assembly to steel arriving from overseas mills. It is impossible to isolate each step as purely domestic. The line where American-made ends and imported content begins has always been blurred. The tariffs tossed a spotlight on that ambiguity and exposed how the auto industry was built on a premise that these countries would remain loosely borderless. No longer just an incremental bump, a 25% slap was a direct assault on the profitability of each unit sold. Even small parts, like wiring harnesses or seatbelt components from Mexico, now risked pushing final prices skyward. Consumers, historically insulated from behind-the-scenes supply logistics, stood on the brink of sticker shock without even realizing it. The wave of compliance confusion also crashed across the industry's legal departments, making them question how to classify each bolt, clamp, and electronic sensor. The F-150 had been the canary in the coal mine, and now its troubles were every automaker's problem. But hidden inside the policy was something even more dangerous: compliance confusion that jammed the gears overnight. But before I get into the details and what it really means, take a moment to subscribe. It is easy, it only takes a second. Thank you. The supply chain nobody saw coming. 7 different border crossings for a single transmission. That is the reality for countless automotive components that feed the United States market. And it is the kind of logistical miracle that, until now, few questioned. Linamar, a Canadian manufacturer deeply involved in building transmissions, epitomizes this maze. At first glance, it seems counterintuitive. Why would a part go back and forth so many times just to end up in an American dealership's lot? The answer lies in decades of seamless integration, thanks to the North American Free Trade Agreement and, more recently, the United States-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement. Factories in Canada may shape the initial metal casing. Then, specialized plants in Mexico may assemble certain gears with cheaper labor before sending the semi-finished product north again for a final tweak. The entire enterprise depends on fluid crossings, minimal tariffs, and confidence that each segment of the assembly chain will function in perfect sync. The moment you introduce a sudden cost burden, the entire route can unravel. With President Donald Trump's new rules, every crossing threatened to add another layer of fees. Companies now faced serious decisions: swallow the cost, pass it to consumers, or attempt to reroute production at breakneck speed. Even the raw materials, like steel or aluminum, are not guaranteed to originate locally. Some factories rely on imports from distant countries to keep quality high and prices manageable. If these materials are slapped with a 25% steel tariff, you end up layering one tariff on top of another. Prices balloon. Suddenly, the entire supply chain that once enabled swift production becomes a cumbersome puzzle that automakers struggle to solve. By the time these metal shafts and gear sets finally arrive at their destination, the tariff toll could be enough to wreck a thin profit margin. The scope of hidden transport routes meant that automakers discovered cost hikes in places they never even thought to look. And even if companies moved everything in-house, they would run headfirst into a different tariff from President Donald Trump. Just move the plant. Isn't that simple? President Donald Trump has often declared that a high tariff is a brilliant motivator, forcing companies to bring their plants back to the United States. But he never revealed the true cost of such a relocation. Building a new automotive facility requires millions of square feet, specialized machinery, and a fully trained workforce. Testing and safety standards take time, sometimes years, to pass. If an automaker decides to shift an entire segment of production from Canada or Mexico, they have to recertify hundreds of suppliers, retrain new employees, and endure potential design changes to comply with different state regulations. The notion of simply uprooting a Canadian plant and dropping it in Michigan is about as practical as hauling a coastline across a continent. Then comes the reality of globalized production strategies. For over 2 decades, major automakers operated as though borders hardly mattered. The North American Free Trade Agreement normalized a web of integrated operations, and the United States-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement did not fundamentally shatter that logic. Manufacturers invested billions of dollars in multi-country footprints, ensuring that engines might be machined in one place, while transmissions were carefully assembled somewhere else. Disentangling that is time-intensive, legally complex, and financially draining. Many corporate executives quickly realized that any attempt to comply overnight would be nearly impossible. Meanwhile, the political clock started ticking. Investors watched nervously, not knowing if companies would try to absorb short-term losses or shuffle production around in a desperate attempt to dodge the tariffs. Even rumors of shifting operations caused shockwaves through local communities, who worried that a plant might close, that workers might be sent home, and that entire regions could lose critical income streams. As the United States stalled on the starting line, anxiously debating how to best handle these new restrictions, the first cracks in the economic foundation had already formed. But the thing is, the economic engine is already misfiring. The hidden tax on every buyer. Buyers didn't see it coming, but their wallets did. For generations, owning a pickup truck symbolized American freedom and resilience. Yet in the blink of an eye, that symbol was shaken by an invisible financial blow. As President Donald Trump's 25% auto tariffs took hold, the ripple effects raced through dealer lots nationwide, creating a shockwave felt by every consumer walking onto dealership grounds. According to an explosive estimate by Cox Automotive, vehicles manufactured in the United States faced unprecedented cost increases. Each American-built car, including beloved pickups, such as the iconic Ford F-150, now carried an additional hidden cost burden of around $3,000, stemming solely from Canada and Mexico tariffs. Another staggering $3,000 piled on top, courtesy of tariffs levied against foreign-made auto parts. When consumers thought the financial bleeding had stopped, another $400 trickled down from Trump's steel and aluminum tariffs, further pushing prices skyward. At dealerships across the country, sticker shock became the new normal. Prices that once attracted blue-collar families now seemed out of reach, pricing them entirely out of cherished traditions. A working-class family in Michigan, hoping to purchase a new Ford F-150, saw their dreams slip beyond grasp. In Texas, ranchers reliant on affordable, durable trucks faced a crushing reality. The cost of upgrading their fleet now demanded painful financial compromises elsewhere. The hidden tariff tax created more than mere economic discomfort. It reshaped the fundamental accessibility of vehicle ownership. Trucks, often used as workhorses to support livelihoods, now appeared as luxury goods reserved for those insulated from economic shifts. The sudden inflationary pressure spread beyond trucks, infecting broader automotive sectors. Sedans, SUVs, and even commercial vehicles suffered dramatic price spikes, adding uncertainty and stress to an already vulnerable consumer market. In Pennsylvania, dealership lots, once humming with excitement, turned eerily quiet. Salespeople watched helplessly as would-be buyers recoiled at elevated prices, shaking their heads in disbelief. Across the nation, what used to be a straightforward purchase turned into tense financial calculations and strained household budgets. But as vehicle prices soared, consumers weren't the only ones caught in the financial crossfire. Dealership owners themselves felt cornered, forced to absorb rising costs or pass them along to customers, knowing either choice risked alienating their customer base permanently. And while buyers choked on these new prices, the real crisis hit the factory floor when the line stops cold. What happens when your flagship trucks stop rolling off the line? At factories across the United States, the unthinkable became daily reality. Assembly lines halted, quieted, and, in some devastating cases, permanently shuttered. Automakers found themselves trapped in a nightmarish scenario, facing critical shortages of foreign-sourced parts vital to vehicle assembly. Ford's iconic assembly line in Dearborn, Michigan, home of the storied F-150, fell eerily silent. Once bustling with activity, the line now paused as critical components, half-shafts from Canada, alternators from Mexico, and tires from South Korea, faced relentless delays or complete shutdowns at ports and customs offices. General Motors and Stellantis felt similar reverberations. At plants in Ohio and Indiana, thousands of workers stood idle, anxiously awaiting parts shipments caught up in tariff disputes. The delays cascaded dramatically. Supply chains meticulously built over decades unraveled within weeks. Internally, panic set in. Company executives scrambled to secure alternative suppliers within the United States, but each attempt met harsh reality. No immediate domestic alternatives existed at scale, and the painful truth emerged starkly. American factories, for all their pride and power, relied heavily on global networks painstakingly established over the years. At supplier plants from Mexico to Canada, production slowed to a crawl as demand vanished overnight, replaced by tariff-imposed uncertainty. Manufacturing workers abroad and domestically watched their livelihoods tremble beneath a geopolitical chess game, uncertain if their next paycheck might be their last. But as lines went quiet, Trump's rhetoric got louder and took a strange new turn. The border war nobody expected. Trump said the tariffs were about trade. Then he blamed Canada and Mexico for fentanyl. The economic narrative shifted suddenly, leaving political observers and diplomats stunned and confused. No longer just about protecting American manufacturing. Tariffs transformed into an accusation, a punitive weapon framed as retaliation against alleged failures to halt the narcotics trade. Relations soured rapidly. Diplomatic ties between the United States and its closest neighbors deteriorated, spiraling toward dangerous lows. Canada and Mexico, longtime economic allies, found themselves targeted as culprits, blamed for a crisis with origins thousands of miles away, primarily in China. Trust evaporated overnight, and goodwill painstakingly cultivated through generations of diplomacy dissipated amidst sharp accusations and inflammatory speeches. Canada's government voiced disbelief, labeling the move as a dangerous precedent that weaponized economic ties. Mexico's leadership likewise recoiled, pointing to joint efforts to combat drug trafficking, efforts now overshadowed and undermined by accusatory rhetoric. The diplomatic fracture radiated further, eroding global confidence in America's reliability as a trading partner. Europe and Asia watched warily, reconsidering their positions and evaluating their vulnerabilities. Global economic alliances wavered, opening cracks that competitors eagerly exploited. And in that vacuum, a silent giant made its move: the Chinese acceleration. While America argued about alternators, China became the world's largest vehicle exporter. Quietly, methodically, and swiftly, Chinese manufacturers moved decisively, seizing advantage from American hesitancy and political turmoil. Amidst U.S. factory closures and price shocks, Chinese automakers surged forward. China's electric vehicle brands rapidly expanded production, leveraging state support, agile supply chains, and stable, cohesive trade strategies. Within mere months, China's exports flooded European and Asian markets, filling voids left by disrupted American manufacturing. This seismic shift revealed stark contrasts. America's automotive sector, crippled by tariffs and political infighting, appeared sluggish and disorganized. In sharp contrast, China displayed speed, coordination, and ruthless efficiency, capitalizing decisively on market opportunities left open by U.S. withdrawal. For the first time, global industry analysts openly speculated on the sustainability of U.S. automotive leadership. Chinese brands, formerly peripheral, gained substantial credibility, offering competitive quality at lower prices. Powered by stable, predictable trade policies and investment-friendly economic climates, U.S. automakers watched helplessly as China carved deep market footholds internationally. Their own positions eroded by relentless internal chaos and escalating prices. The reality struck painfully home. America's decades-long automotive dominance faced unprecedented existential threats, not from tariffs alone, but from their chaotic execution and political misuse. Meanwhile, U.S. labor found itself caught between hope and heartbreak. Built in America with robots, Trump promised jobs. But the only thing coming back was automation. When President Donald Trump proudly announced tariffs aimed at forcing automakers to bring production back to American shores, thousands of factory workers envisioned a revival of the once thriving automotive towns. Yet, when the first new plants opened their doors after the tariffs took effect, it wasn't bustling lines of American workers that emerged. Instead, gleaming rows of robots lined the factory floors. In a brutal twist of economic irony, Trump's tariffs, intended to rebuild American employment, only accelerated a shift already underway: automation. Facing punishing 25% tariffs on imported parts, companies had two stark choices: either swallow catastrophic losses or dramatically reduce costs elsewhere. Predictably, automakers chose the cold calculus of efficiency, opting for machines over people. After all, robots don't strike, they don't tire, and they never demand higher wages. Within months, brand new factories popped up across the Midwest and southern states, but these were not the labor-intensive operations that blue-collar communities had envisioned. Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis collectively invested billions into state-of-the-art plants, brimming with automation, artificial intelligence, and advanced robotics. Even tasks once considered purely human domain, complex assemblies, delicate inspections, and nuanced adjustments, were methodically assigned to automated systems. By the end of 2024, the net employment numbers told a stark story. Despite new factory openings branded proudly as "Made in America," the total number of automotive manufacturing jobs remained flat, and in many regions, actually fell. Towns in Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, which had placed their trust and hope in these tariffs, saw fewer workers clocking into factories each morning. In their place, robotic arms welded frames with relentless precision. Automated guided vehicles carried heavy components, and software-driven inspection drones buzzed along conveyor belts. Economists highlighted the harsh logic behind these decisions. Automation isn't cheap, but in the wake of sustained tariffs and uncertainty, it represented predictable and stable costs compared to the volatility of trade wars. Companies that had initially resisted full-scale automation now saw no other way to remain competitive. Shareholders and executives, driven by the relentless pursuit of profitability and market survival, saw automation as a necessary shield against Trump's volatile policies. Human workers were deemed too costly, too unpredictable. Communities expecting vibrant new job markets were confronted instead by nearly silent factories humming smoothly without human chatter. And as employment stalled or declined, local economies contracted. Restaurants closed, schools suffered budget cuts, and once thriving downtowns became ghostly quiet. Automation, ironically enabled by policies meant to restore employment, drained the lifeblood from towns Trump claimed to champion. And for union workers, that cold logic hit like a betrayal. The union dilemma. The United Auto Workers cheered the tariffs. They didn't expect what came next. In union halls from Detroit to Cleveland, Trump's tariff announcement had been met with jubilation. Decades of watching jobs flee overseas had fostered deep resentment and desperation. Finally, they believed tariffs would bring back the dignity of union employment and restore negotiating power long eroded by globalization. But that optimism quickly turned bitter. Union leaders soon found themselves knocking on locked doors. Automakers opening factories in response to tariffs were explicitly choosing locations with weaker union presences, such as Alabama, Tennessee, and South Carolina. These right-to-work states offered corporations lower labor costs, fewer regulatory hurdles, and critically, less union influence. While shiny new factories arose, union representatives discovered that these plants had no intention of embracing unionized labor. The bitter irony wasn't lost on workers who had once cheered the tariffs. Job postings appeared for highly skilled technicians and robotic specialists, positions not easily filled by traditional automotive workers. Union leaders were powerless as automakers sidestepped contracts, reducing collective bargaining leverage significantly. The tariffs that had promised to empower labor unions instead isolated them, exposing fundamental divisions within the union itself. Frustration quickly morphed into division. Some union members clung desperately to the hope of eventual inclusion, while others openly criticized their leadership for supporting tariffs without securing clear protections or guarantees. Internal meetings turned heated, with accusations of betrayal and incompetence tearing at the seams of union solidarity. This turmoil bled outward, damaging trust within communities that relied on union wages and benefits. Generations had built lives around the promises of stable, secure automotive employment. Suddenly, union leaders appeared either naive or complicit in the erosion of those very promises. And all of this uncertainty left automakers in limbo. Certainty collapses. You can't build billion-dollar factories on political quicksand. At the heart of any manufacturing investment is one non-negotiable element: predictability. Trump's tariffs, however, brought anything but clarity. Automakers found themselves trapped in a relentless cycle of policy whiplash. Exemptions announced today vanish tomorrow. Tariffs delayed, then suddenly enforced. Regulations shifting almost weekly. This volatility turned long-term strategic planning into a guessing game, paralyzing decision-making across the industry. Investor confidence plummeted as executives struggled to provide clear guidance. Multi-billion-dollar projects stalled mid-design, frozen by uncertainty. Banks and investment groups balked at lending billions for plants that might become financially unviable overnight due to a sudden policy shift. As uncertainty permeated boardrooms, projects were delayed indefinitely or canceled outright, freezing thousands of potential jobs in bureaucratic amber. Even companies desperate to avoid the cost spiral of tariffs were unable to commit fully to relocating production stateside without assurances of long-term stability. Engineering teams watched helplessly as planned production lines and supplier contracts were repeatedly scrapped and rewritten. In factories across America, timelines slipped by months, then years, each delay adding millions to the final bill. By late 2024, industry leaders openly expressed exasperation. Prominent CEOs warned policymakers that without clarity and consistency, automotive manufacturing would wither, crippling America's competitive advantage. Yet even these pleas failed to stabilize policy. And the more they delayed, the more the system started breaking from the inside. Warehouses full of nothing. America's factories were full, but not with cars, with waste. As Trump's tariff chaos continued unabated, automakers faced logistical nightmares they'd never imagined possible. To buffer against tariff-induced disruptions, manufacturers began frantically stockpiling parts and materials. Massive warehouses sprawled outward, packed floor to ceiling, not with finished cars, but with engines, transmissions, tires, steel coils, and electronic components, many rendered obsolete as quickly as they'd been acquired. Companies overordered out of fear and uncertainty, locking up vast sums of capital in excess inventory. Trucks lined up at factory gates, idling for hours, only to unload pallets destined for dusty shelves. Warehousing costs skyrocketed, chewing up funds that could have driven innovation or improved production efficiency. Supply chain managers described a climate of perpetual crisis management, constantly pivoting from one uncertainty-driven panic to another. This accumulation of soft waste, wasted time, effort, and resources, began quietly eroding competitiveness. While American plants struggled with logistical nightmares, overseas competitors enjoyed streamlined, efficient supply chains. Resources spent on warehousing and managing chaotic inventory systems drained productivity and distracted from critical forward-looking investment in technology and development. Meanwhile, inefficiency bloomed unchecked. Duplicate orders filled loading bays, unused equipment piled up, and management teams were forced into endless firefighting instead of strategic thinking. Rather than ramping up for a future of electric vehicles and high-tech innovations, American automakers were trapped in a cycle of reactionary decisions. While all of this is happening, Europe has been quietly moving forward, leaving America stuck in a gridlock. As America retreated, Europe advanced, with deals that rewrote the global auto map. But before we proceed, I ask you to subscribe once again. Just do it and I will move to the next topic. Thanks. Europe moves in. American policymakers scrambled to manage the fallout from a fractured auto industry. But across the Atlantic, a quieter, yet far more coordinated shift was unfolding. In boardrooms from Berlin to Brussels, European leaders seized on the chaos caused by United States tariffs to offer stability, trade access, and investment incentives. The world was watching Trump's economic brinkmanship, but Europe wasn't just watching. they were positioning. The European Union struck fast and decisively. New trade deals with Japan and South Korea, negotiated with speed and precision, cemented open auto corridors that bypassed United States tariffs entirely. The European Union-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, already in effect, became a crucial lifeline for Japanese automakers who had been spooked by American protectionism. Suddenly, it was easier to send vehicles from Tokyo to Berlin than from Detroit to Toronto. The European Union-Korea Free Trade Agreement offered even more leverage. With no 25% penalty in sight, Korean companies like Hyundai and Kia shifted production and export strategies toward Europe. European markets didn't just offer scale, they offered certainty. Automakers are addicted to planning, and in a world ruled by unpredictable tariff announcements, Europe became the last place where long-term stability still existed. As the American auto sector stumbled, global capital began to pivot. Investors and supply chain strategists, increasingly frustrated with United States policy whiplash, rerouted billions of dollars in investment from North America to Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and the European Union. New factories in Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania were greenlit to meet demand that was once expected to come from American soil. The scale of redirection was staggering. Electric vehicle battery plants, previously scouted for construction in Texas and Michigan, were now breaking ground in Spain and Austria. German automotive giants started reallocating their research and development budgets away from their United States subsidiaries. Even Asian auto suppliers, historically tethered to the North American market, began designing their logistics infrastructure for the European continent instead. And perhaps most striking of all was how global supply chains themselves began to decouple from United States dominance, where once American ports and transportation routes had been central hubs for the movement of vehicles, engines, and semiconductors. New logistics corridors blossomed in Europe. The EU's centrally managed trade infrastructure made it easier for manufacturers to plan, build, and deliver without worrying whether their next shipment would be met with an arbitrary tariff or political backlash. The United States has always held sway not just because of its consumer market, but because of its predictability. Now, with each new tariff threat or diplomatic conflict, it was becoming the most volatile partner in the global supply chain. And in business, volatility is the enemy of investment. By the time American lawmakers began publicly questioning the long-term impact of the tariffs, the damage had already been done. Multinational corporations had refiled their tax strategies, moved distribution centers, and cut ties with North American suppliers who had become too expensive or too unpredictable to rely on. And when Europe moved in, investors took note. Their reaction? It sent shockwaves through Wall Street. Wall Street's awakening. The numbers weren't just bad, they were catastrophic. When the third and fourth quarter earnings reports hit, the auto industry was in a full-blown financial nosedive. Ford's North American operating margins dropped sharply, while General Motors issued a profit warning that rattled analysts. Stellantis, home to brands like Jeep, Dodge, and Ram, reported that unexpected production halts had shaved billions off its projected revenue. The mood on earnings calls turned somber, defensive, and at times desperate. Wall Street analysts, who had once been bullish on the automotive sector, began issuing downgrades with language usually reserved for recessionary environments. Terms like structural instability and uncontained volatility appeared in investor notes, which had previously projected strong growth into the mid-2030s. Hedge funds that had been heavily invested in American auto futures scrambled to rebalance portfolios, shifting assets into European and Asian industrials. Shareholders didn't just panic, they acted. A wave of sell-offs hit Detroit's big three automakers. In a span of weeks, Ford lost billions in market capitalization. General Motors faced activist investor pressure to spin off its electric vehicle division, while Stellantis quietly began exploring options to pull manufacturing away from its Midwest factories. Lawsuits followed. Shareholder litigation accused automakers of failing to adequately disclose tariff exposure. Class action suits emerged on behalf of investors who believed they had been misled about supply chain resilience. And while corporate legal teams battled in courtrooms, executive teams were being grilled in boardrooms. The pressure was not only financial, it was existential. Automotive CEOs faced increasing scrutiny over whether they had bet too heavily on the North American market and whether their ties to United States policymakers had compromised their global strategies. In one infamous conference call, an auto executive was asked point-blank whether the company had contingency plans plans for a future in which the United States was no longer a viable production base. But it wasn't just the stock tickers that were flashing red. The bleeding extended far beyond Wall Street's glass towers. Because while analysts debated margins and investors measured losses, everyday Americans were living the fallout, the everyday cost of economic war. These weren't just corporate losses. They were family ones. In small towns from Iowa to Indiana, the pain from the auto collapse hit like a sledgehammer. Pickup trucks, once the affordable workhorses of the middle class, had become luxuries. Average transaction prices jumped by over $6,000 in less than 2 years. For rural buyers who relied on trucks for their livelihoods, the math no longer worked. At the dealership level, things were even worse. Family-owned franchises were shuttering. Rows of unsold inventory sat baking in the sun. Service departments, usually the lifeblood of small dealerships, were laying off mechanics, parts clerks, and service managers. The knock-on effects were brutal. Local banks saw auto loan defaults surge. Auto repair shops closed. Regional newspapers were filled with headlines about plant layoffs and bankrupt suppliers. In Ohio, one buyer recounted the moment he realized his dream of owning a new truck was dead. It wasn't even a luxury trim, he said, just a basic work truck. But after the price jumped, it was more than my mortgage. In Michigan, a laid-off assembly worker told local reporters, "They said we'd get our jobs back. That's what they promised. I voted for it. Now I'm watching my son leave for a non-union warehouse job just to keep the lights on." The promises had been big. Made in America, jobs coming home, factories reopening. But in the absence of realistic execution, those promises had backfired. The tariffs meant to rebuild America's middle class had, for many, helped dismantle it. Worse still, there was no clear path to recovery. Tariff policy remained in limbo. Automakers, burned by instability, were hesitant to reinvest. Union trust in both government and corporate leadership was fractured, and international partners had moved on. But just as the dust seemed to settle and Americans began to reckon with what had been lost, Washington hinted that the fight was far from over. The next wave. The tariffs weren't the end, they were the beginning. Even as factories sat idle and prices spiked, policymakers in Washington began preparing for a new round of trade restrictions. This time, they were looking beyond automobiles. Next in the crosshairs, electric vehicle batteries and semiconductor chips. Early drafts of legislation hinted at targeted tariffs on lithium-ion battery imports from China, South Korea, and Indonesia. Another draft proposed heavy duties on advanced chipsets, used in everything from autonomous vehicles to infotainment systems, that were primarily manufactured in Taiwan and Malaysia. Analysts feared that the next round of penalties would disrupt electric vehicle production and digital automotive components even more severely than the original car tariffs. The international response was swift. China issued retaliatory threats, warning of tariffs on American agricultural goods and aerospace components. South Korea hinted at canceling planned joint ventures with United States automakers. The European Union expressed deep concern about the broadening of protectionist policy in a post-pandemic global economy. But the real transformation wasn't just policy, it was ideological. What had begun as an attempt to protect American jobs had morphed into a doctrine of economic isolation. Trade partners who once saw the United States as a stable anchor now viewed it as a wild card, capable of upending decades of commerce with a single press conference. For multinational companies, that shift in perception changed everything. Long-term supply chain planning was no longer feasible. Capital allocation strategies were rewritten. Insurance premiums on cross-border logistics surged. Executives began openly discussing the need to de-risk their exposure to United States unpredictability. And for investors, the signal was deafening. The world was moving on. Protectionism had locked in as the new global posture, but the United States was no longer leading the charge. It was driving the wedge. What started with a truck didn't just destroy an industry. It may have destroyed the very idea of global trade. But what I want to know is your opinions. So let's talk down in the comments. Thanks.